Hi, good day, everyone. Welcome to Journalism, Tech Platforms, and the Future of Media Policy. This is a workshop organized by the Dynamic Coalition on the Sustainability of Journalism and News Media, DC Sustainability for short. My name is Daniel O'Malley. I'm the Deputy Editor and Digital Policy Specialist at the Center for International Media Assistance based in Washington, DC. And I'm also one of the co-coordinators of the Dynamic Coalition, along with Courtney Ratch, who unfortunately is not able to be with us today. I'm pleased to be serving as the moderator for today's session, which is a part of this year's World Press Freedom Day celebrations. And today is Coalition Day. This is where UNESCO has organized a number of sessions with various regional and thematic coalitions to discuss their work and strategize policies going forward. Really just a time for us all to connect around this World Press Freedom Day. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Dynamic Coalition, DC Sustainability is a multi-stakeholder working group that is part of the Internet Governance Forum process, and GFMD serves as the secretariat. The Dynamic Coalition was organized 2 years ago out of a recognition that oftentimes the discussion and implementation of digital policies, new internet governance policies, were being made without really much consideration for how they would impact news and journalism around the world. And even in the case where it was addressed, they were often not taking into account the impacts in developed countries, which means that these policies aren't taking into account for how people around the world in many places will actually be impacted. So that's the kind of what we're trying to do here. I think you all know that the digital transformation has upended news media in just about every way, from how journalists do reporting to how news outlets disseminate their news, but also, perhaps most importantly, it's fundamentally shifted the advertising market and how journalism is funded. So these are the kind of issues that we want to talk about today. If we're thinking about information as a public good, we also have to think about how we can fund that, how we can make that sustainable so that citizens have access to high quality news and reporting. So I'd like to really quickly shift to talking about today's agenda. We have an hour allotted total for our session, and the first half of our session will be dealing with updates from around the world. We have a number of invited speakers who are going to be sharing with us the most recent updates on these issues from their regions. I've asked them all to be very brief and limit their interventions to 4 minutes. And this is because in the second half of the meeting, we will have an open discussion. So for those of you, you can either type your questions and interventions into the chat feature that you have, or if you're in the Zoom meeting with us, you can raise your hand and state your question and intervention with us. Our goal is to have as much of an interactive session as possible, given the limitations that we're kind of facing in this virtual world and the platform world that we've been living in now for a little over a year. A couple housekeeping things. I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves, just their name and organization right before they speak. Without further ado, I'd like to, let's get the conversation started. We're going to have our around the world updates, and we're going to start with Corinne Podger, so we can kind of get the views from Australia, which has been something that's been really of great interest to people in our field over the past 6 months or so. Corinne?
Thank you, Daniel. So you heard there, my name is Corinne Podger, and I'm an independent consultant. Most of my work is with media development agencies and working with journalists in developing countries. I've got 4 minutes, so I've written this down so I keep it more or less to time. So here we go. Okay, so in February, everyone in Australia, as you probably know, lost access to news on Facebook for about a week. And we were caught up in a game of chicken between Canberra, Google and Facebook over what was called the News Media Bargaining Code. It's a bill that was introduced early last year, designed to force big tech to pay for news content linked to or shared on their platforms. Now, the ban didn't just affect outlets that would benefit from the code. It took down regional and Indigenous pages that didn't stand to make a dime. It hid pages run by state health departments and also our National Weather Bureau in the middle of a pandemic and the bushfire season. So it made Australians who care about the news feel like Facebook didn't really care about them. In the end, our government watered down the bill, passed it into law. Facebook lifted the news ban. Google struck deals for news showcase with big media publishers and didn't follow through with a threat to shut down search in Australia. Now, my colleagues on the panel are experts on media policy, so I want to dig a little bit more into the journalism element of this session and specifically how the ban impacted access to information in the Pacific. Mobile data plans in the Pacific usually include cheap Facebook access, so you can get the news without visiting a website. In countries like Papua New Guinea, Australian content is often shared to correct or rebuff misinformation, and newsrooms use it to shape the day's agenda. So if you can't see it, you can't share it. And one has to ask, with COVID ravaging Papua New Guinea right now, where would we be if the ban was still in place? Anyway, the ban was lifted. So I want to think about what we learned from it as an industry, and I've got 3 takeaways. So first, some people wanted it to be longer. Researchers in Queensland said that a longer ban might have forced Australians to look for news elsewhere and help us understand what might trigger that behaviour, where would they go, and whether they would be more willing to pay. Second, the ban coincided with an intense and unprecedented period of learning for our industry in response to last year's collapse of the ad revenue. That forced more than 100 media outlets in Australia to shut just last year. And everyone who's still open is highly motivated to keep it that way, Facebook or no Facebook. The pandemic has kept us in learning mode. How do we report remotely? How do we do socially distanced interviews? How do we publish a paper when everyone's working from home? Time and again, I've heard editors and reporters say they've had to innovate more this past year than in the previous decade. So we are super primed right now for innovation. And I want to close with an observation. What I see separates titles that are innovating successfully from those that are just scraping by. First, while our industry shares challenges, there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. But I do think we're seeing the emergence of a one-size-fits-all mindset, one that accepts that journalism is an industry as well as a profession, and like any industry, it needs to make its own money to stay in business. It's a mindset that embraces concepts like human-centered and data-driven product design, that asks, why do we do what we do? Who is it for? Do they actually want it? And would they pay for it? And should it sometimes be offered for free? The mindset is easier to cultivate in big newsrooms, I think, where time, resources, and tech can be harnessed and channeled without too much disruption to business as usual. But it's not impossible for smaller outlets. And I'm going to leave you with 2 very short case studies. The first one is Project Kookaburra. It's a Walkley Foundation project that helped 5 family-run regional Australian newspapers boost digital revenue last year. The editors were trained over 6 months in community listening, smart goal setting, and pilot and test methods. Now that's a small project. You can't just help a few outlets and leave the rest to struggle. So last week, the Judith Neilson Institute ran a hyperlocal summit here. And out of that will come a new hyperlocal Association for Australia. And the aim of that is to help tiny outlets across the country plug their knowledge gaps on tech, data, advertising, services and e-commerce, and to do so quickly and most importantly at scale, so they can serve the communities with the information they need to make informed decisions about their lives. So that's the news from Australia. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Corinne. That's really something that's very interesting to hear, that perspective and the dire situation with 100 media outlets closing in the past year. It's really something. We're now going to turn to Tanja Maksic from Bern, Serbia, from the view from Southeast Europe. Tanja?
Well, hello everyone. My name is Tanja Maksic. I work for Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. We're actually covering the entire Balkans region, but I'm based here in Belgrade in Serbia, and I will try to give you a brief overview on financial and revenue streams for the media outlets to secure their sustainability. Of course, the primary being advertising market, which is worth around 20 million euros annually. Sorry, 200 million euros annually. In 2020, we saw the drop of 10 million euros, which is not that significant, fortunately for us, but it's still quite a lot of money for the pretty impoverished industry that we are facing with. Digital revenues are the only one actually marking some sort of growth, and they now comprise about 40% of total advertising market in Serbia. TV is still very much dominant, especially the national TV. They take the major chunk of the advertising market, and radio and press are unfortunately in decline. That is more or less, I think, trend all over the world. Second stream of revenue for media is actually the state monies, and this is where we have a lot of issues with. So in Serbia, there is a state financing mechanism, so-called project-based co-funding, which actually means that media should come up with their project and submit them to local self-governments or to the Republican Ministry of Culture and Information, and get rewarded or not get rewarded for those projects, and that's how they secure their financing. In 2020 and 2020, we traced 20 million euros spent through this mechanism. What was very problematic is actually the allocation of this money, which was mostly used to save the media who are close to government and to the ruling party, or somehow affiliated to them. In the talking about the sustainability, I would like to point out two issues which are quite important for our context. One is actually the ownership structures, which are transparently or less transparently somehow leading to the ruling party and to the government officials that have ties to ownership towards the media outlets. And these ownership structures actually allow them easier access to the state money. And also the other question is actually concentration issues. We had in 2020 the issue of our major telecom operator, which is also state-owned company, investing huge amount of money in buying smaller cable operators, but also buying and creating their own media stations, effectively becoming quite strong competition to traditional media. And this situation actually describes how fragile media industry can be, and how hard it can compete with other industries that are more robust, such as telecom industry or IT industry, which can actually tailor our information environment, and can actually curb our right to be properly informed. Just a quick overview of policies that are related to our platform and AI environment. We are, of course, very much lagging behind, and we don't have concrete policies, solutions. But what is good that we actually started this policy dialogue, initiated some policy dialogue in Serbia related to these issues, which are becoming more and more issues of protecting the right to be informed and the freedom of expression. One of them is the research of the ROMEX indicators created by UNESCO that will be done in Serbia by the end of this year, and we hope for that research to become some sort of policy base for further dialogues. We also started conversations with Ministry of Culture and with OSCE mission in Serbia, being included, and independent journalistic organization in Serbia about usage of AI in newsrooms and media sector. GDPR is also something that was taken over from the EU policy framework and somehow transferred to Serbia, but it's somehow becoming more and more important tool for protection of privacy issues. And just to mention one more initiative, which was started actually by Facebook, and they created partnership with two fact-checking organizations in Serbia who are checking the content on in Serbian language on this platform, searching for disinformation or hate speech or something like that. And also initiatives coming from our sector trying to support digital transformation, especially of our local media outlets who are desperate of need in knowledge and resources how to navigate through all of this situation.
Great,
so
thank you, Tanya.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tanya. Yeah, no, it's very clear, you know, especially the issue that I'm talking about, you know, fragile news ecosystem in general and how these other big actors can have such an outsized impact on our environment very quickly. We're now going to turn to Mira, who's going to give us the view from the EU. And I know she's going to be very concise and keep it to very quick.
Yes, my name is Mira Milosevic. I'm the Executive Director of a Global Forum for Media Development. And we are privileged to facilitate both the dynamic coalition on journalism and news media sustainability within the IGF and all our colleagues and friends here, but also a very active group of civil society and NGO experts and media experts in Europe who are working on media policy and advocacy. So I will give just a short update on different policy processes that are happening at the moment. And there is a lot. And as you've heard from Tanya, and you will hear, and Corinne, and you will hear from others, there's so many things that we are looking at the same time, and the capacity of civil society to respond with appropriate policy suggestions and ideas is very limited. That's why groups like this one is of big benefit and help to all of us. So quickly then, European Commission is currently working on advanced drafts of both Digital Media Act and Digital Services Act. These are completely new pieces of legislations and most importantly, something that we would call hard regulation that will regulate the complete digital sphere, and both acts have strong impact on news media, journalism, sustainability, freedom of expression, and freedom of information. And both are very complex, and we are looking at some layers. All the organizations that we are working with and our members in Europe have submitted their comments to DSA, but very few are working and looking at Digital Markets Act. At the moment, the phase that we are looking at is that the texts are with different committees in the European Parliament. Unfortunately, there are 4 different committees looking at this, and we are expecting reports from them very soon, and hopefully advanced drafts in the summer. There's some good news in those drafts, but there are also fears that the European Commission is not going far enough to protect freedom of expression, to make a level playing field for media, and to provide innovative solutions to disinformation. The second interesting regulatory development is happening at the moment with long debated terrorist content regulation proposal, TEREG, which is about to be adopted by the European Parliament. And despite of civil society, digital rights defenders, journalism and media institutions arguing that there are not enough due process guarantees and protections in this regulation, it is unfortunately being adopted and is setting a precedent of enabling any competent authority to delete content online by requiring hosting service providers to remove content within 1 hour. I don't have to explain to you how dangerous this is in countries that will abuse this. And of course, it's dangerous also from the perspective of content being removed without due processes. And we're already seeing over removals by some of the platforms. At the same time, we are having a new code of practice on disinformation is also being drafted, and today was actually the deadline for consultation submissions on the roadmap for this self-regulatory piece of regulation. And unfortunately, a lot of issues that we were expected to be regulated by Digital Services Act are relegated, so to say, to the Code of Practice on Disinformation. And this is also really important from the perspective of journalism and news media sustainability to contribute to this process as well, so that disinformation is not resolved only by counteraction, by trying to remove, stop, and prevent it from happening, but also with affirmative action with supporting journalism. Then there is also a separate piece on online advertising regulation, and especially political advertising transparency, where the position of our community is, of course, complete transparency that's needed in digital advertising. There is also European artificial intelligence regulation, and last Wednesday, the Commission presented its draft regulation. It's also interesting from the perspective of how the European Commission sees fake news, deep fakes, and artificial intelligence manipulated content. And finally, there is a European Media Freedom Act that's been announced by Commissioner Breton last week. And it is expected that this act will build on the existing Audiovisual Media Services Directive, and that will provide more powers and ingerences to European Commission to regulate media sphere. Do I have another minute, or am I?
No, that you put a lot on the table. That's really great, Mira. You know, I think there's two things that come to mind just immediately after that. One is that, you know, all content moderation policies also affect media outlets, not just in terms of dissemination, but in terms of the financial sustainability model. If you're not able to be breaking the news and get it out there, how do you sustain yourself, right? And then two, just the fact that the policies set in the EU or have much broader reverberations within the broader European area, but also globally. So it's really important for us to follow those. Thank you.
Sorry, we also have colleagues here who are experts in certain areas that I mentioned. So maybe we can hear from them later, and they can give more detail on the most important bits.
Yeah, that would be great. We're now going to turn to Vusu, who's going to give us the perspective from Africa. Vusu, who I believe is on the beach today.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. Yeah, and may I apologize in advance for some, as you can hear, there's someone in the background who is trying to get my attention. I'm on a short break with my family, and I had to find a slot where the network is very good. But unfortunately, where I am, you may be getting a lot of background interference. But for the sake of colleagues who are interacting with me for the first time, I'm Vusumu Zisifile. I'm the Executive Director of Panos Institute Southern Africa and a member of the GFMD and of the DC Sustainability Group. So in terms of the situation in Southern Africa, which is mostly the same across Sub-Saharan Africa, I think in the last few months, we have seen an increase or a proliferation in the use of online platforms by citizens to seek, share, and access information. And this has challenged in a great way the media to go digital. We've seen an increase in the number of media platforms that have ventured into the digital space. Of course, there are still a lot of issues in terms of the content or the quality of the content that we see on some of the the digital spaces. But at the same time, we have also seen an increase in the government interest in terms of regulating or controlling the use of the digital spaces, the internet for access to information. We've seen, like in Zambia, where we are based, recently, I think a few weeks back, the government actually enacted a new law on cybersecurity, which of course they say is meant to fight hate speech, fight the use of like online fraud and stuff. But there are a lot of indications that the law may actually negatively affect the freedom of citizens' exercise of freedom of expression online. It may restrict the extent to which citizens can engage with each other and with decision makers in terms of addressing issues of concern. We've seen also, I think this introduction of cyber laws is, I think there's quite a number of them across Southern Africa. We've seen them in Tanzania, we've seen them in Zimbabwe, we have Zambia, and all of them, they seem to be coming from a similar template, or they are drawing from the same source because the intentions are in most cases the same. We've also seen like there's a reluctance in some cases to either enact access to information laws, as is the case in Zambia, as some of you may be aware that Zambia currently does not have an access to information law. Access to information is provided for in the Constitution, but there is no enabling legislation for the realization of that constitutional provision. And it has become a trend, like whenever there is an election, that whoever is seeking elections will promise that they will enact the access to information law, which has been pending for more than 20 years now. So those are some of the, I think, serious issues in this space. And also, I think there is need also to digitally empower our citizens to use the internet and other digital tools to engage with each other and with decision makers. As you may be aware, the majority of citizens in Southern Africa, they rely a lot on radio as the preferred and most accessible medium of communication. But in most cases, you find that even the radio signal, like where I am right now, the signal is not so good. So there is need to broaden the spaces which citizens can use to seek, share, and receive information. Yeah, I think I can pause here. Then if there are maybe follow-ups, we can engage in the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vusu, and thanks for taking the time out of your vacation to talk with us. And I think that's a really important thing that you're mentioning about, you know, we might have it in the constitution of a country that access to information is there, but information as a public good is still something that we're all fighting for and that we're also having to renegotiate in this digital space. And that's what we're trying to deal with. So thanks you for bringing those perspectives from Sub-Saharan Africa. And we're now going to turn to the views from the US. And I'm really glad to see that Anya Schifrin and Tim Carr are with us. So we're gonna, we do want to try to be brief so that we can engage in a little bit of conversation. So I'll ask Anya and Tim to be concise, and I think we'll go ahead and start with Anya.
Great. Would you like me to go first?
Yes, please. Please
okay, sure. So right now, there were two bills reintroduced in Congress. One is the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, and that proposes a series of 3 tax credits aimed at bolstering local newspapers and media. It has quite a bit of bipartisan support, and most of the sort of independent local papers support this bill, and it provides direct subsidies for news subscribers, local journalists, and small business advertisers. Don't know if it'll get passed, but that's probably the most popular bill. Then we have the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which was originally introduced in April 29 and reintroduced by Senator Klobuchar, who's made a big effort at taking on big tech, and Representative David Cicilline from Rhode Island, who's another big player in this space. That's another bipartisan bill, and it would allow the news publishers to work together to establish distribution and payment deals with digital platforms. So that's a sort of a safe harbor from antitrust liability. So those are the sort of two main bills. Then I just published recently a super interesting piece in Columbia Journalism Review, which was really about the battle going on between Steve Waldman and Bob McChesney. Steve is supporting a lot of these bills and an idea for transplanting, which would take some of the small outlets that are owned by hedge funds and buy them back and turn them into nonprofits. Robert McChesney has a much more ambitious, a sort of Green New Deal for journalism. He wants billions of dollars spent on journalism. And he's all kinds of ideas about how that money could be allocated. So I put that piece, I think I put it on our group. Canada has mostly been focused on the tax credits idea. They've got a labor journalism tax credit, which helps cover the cost of labor. They've got some, stipulations about what an eligible newsroom employee would be. They've also been giving, all kinds of tax credits to people that subscribe. So I would say the bottom line is the US is super behind everybody else and probably will end up really following whatever Europe does to a large extent in terms of platform regulation. So I'll just say one word about, I had this event with 5 competition ministers 2 weeks ago and used the opportunity to ask a bunch of the questions that Tim Carr and others have had about the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. And he basically confirmed that, yes, it does privilege the larger outlets because it gives money based on what you're already doing. So if you're already big, you're going to get more money than if you're small. He did say that, obviously, as we all know, Australia's done tons of other things to help the smaller outlets. And he pointed out, I asked him about Tim's idea of this tax on micro-targeting and then using that to support news. And as you know, people who do taxes hate that kind of thing because they don't really like earmarked taxes. I mean, they do it all the time, right? For, tobacco or roads, but they don't like that. And his view was the big tech companies need to pay taxes and governments need to help journalism, but we can't mush them together. And then I won't go too much into Germany and France because I think Mira covered it, but they both basically, they're looking at what Australia is doing, but they've got the copyright law. Canada was the only country that said, yes, for sure, we're going down the Australia path. And the main difference there is Canada's got a long tradition of supporting local and indigenous media because they wanted to protect them from the US. So they'll do it in a sort of made in Canada way. And then South Africa said that Australia has been a huge wake-up call, and they are now starting to have discussions about what they can do. They feel that because they're sort of small and relatively powerless, they need A, Southern Africa to work with them, and B, they would really like to see some sort of UN or international organization overseeing a lot of this. So in sum, the Australia law has definitely gotten attention. People are looking at it, government officials are looking closely all around the world to see, what they should be copying. And, as usual, the US is light years behind everybody else. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ahmed.
And I can share my writing up with everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very appreciative. And thank you for making, I know you had another really important obligation today, a dissertation defense. So it's good to see you. And now I'd like to quickly turn to Tim Carr, who can maybe add on to any other things that you wanted to highlight.
Sure. And thanks, Tanya, for that really important overview. Again, I'm Tim Carr with Free Press. We're a not-for-profit organization based in the US. We have 1.4 million members, and a lot of our work involves organizing and educating people to get involved in the somewhat arcane world of media policy, because we believe that without that sort of public engagement and policy making, you'll see policies that benefit the large media corporations and not the public at large. So as we're having this discussion about the future of journalism and media policy, the world's largest tech companies, including Google, Facebook, Amazon, are reporting their quarterly earnings. And the news for them is very, very good. The streak of record level earnings in digital advertising is expected to continue through the first 3 months of 2021. But what's good news for these tech giants is bad news for most traditional news outlets around the world. To understand what I mean, it's useful to think of US tech platforms as extraction industries that take advertising revenues out of local news economies. The response of lawmakers, as we've heard around the world, has been to craft policies that make big tech pay for the damage it's done. The Bargaining Code in Australia and the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act in the US are good examples of this response. Essentially, these policies seek to force tech platforms into payment negotiations with news outlets in exchange for linking to their content. And that's a very simple interpretation. Obviously, we could talk about that in more detail. But is facilitating payment negotiations between new media and old really the right answer? And is big tech entirely to blame for the present day crisis in journalism? I would argue that the market-driven model that once sustained news production isn't sustainable in a world where attention is the main commodity, and that any policy solution that merely props up the media's old guard is simply prolonging the life of a commercial news system that never really served all of the people. I hope to have a chance to explain this in more detail during our upcoming discussion. Free Press believes a sound approach to creating more diverse and thriving a news sector can be achieved by imposing a tax on online advertising. The resulting revenue would be placed in a public interest media endowment and used to fund the kinds of local, independent, and non-commercial news that's gone missing from too many communities. For example, a 2% ad tax on 2020 US advertising revenues would yield more than $2 billion for this public interest media endowment. And this is just one approach. There are many others, and we've heard a lot of them today. Anya, as she mentioned, has hosted many interesting discussions about the use of tax credits and tax vouchers to help fund public interest journalism. Any solution that policymakers undertake must be built on the fundamental belief that public interest journalism is a societal good, that it is essential infrastructure for democracy, and that governments must play a central role in funding this infrastructure if they hope to see local democracy thrive. Anya has really covered the landscape in the United States. We are working for and against some of the policies that she has outlined. You can learn more about that by visiting Free Press. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tim. Really appreciate that. We're now going to move to the open discussion. Before, I just want to mention that we had one more panelist who wasn't able to make it from Brazil. So I think there was a scheduling issue there. So we won't be hearing from kind of the update on some of the policies in Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay that have had caught some attention recently. But we're now having a kind of a broader open discussion now. We do have, we're actually operating on a couple different platforms here. So I believe that some people who are viewing through the UNESCO platform, in order for you to participate, you'll be able to pose questions that are written down and that will then be circulated with us here in the Zoom chat. So if you have just questions or interventions, please go ahead and use that functionality that you see on your end to do that. On our end, some of us are out in a Zoom meeting, so to speak. I'll ask you to kind of please use the raised hand feature to jump into the speaking queue and to kind of continue this really interesting conversation. From the perspective of myself as a coordinator of this dynamic coalition, one of the things I have my eye on is, we're always planning about identifying these really interesting topics that our speakers have highlighted and thinking about how we can take them to the global internet governance level. The IGF this year is going to be held in December in Poland, probably in a hybrid version. I think some of these policies really need to be discussed at that level because, if you copy and paste some of these policies from one country to another, it just doesn't work. It really depends on the political context. And so you could really end up doing some danger by having what works at one place be implemented by an authoritarian regime somewhere else, and it's really actually used as a cudgel to repress the press. And I think that was something that kind of Vusu highlighted in terms of some of the regulation that's going on in Zambia around cybersecurity that might have some other motives behind it. But one of the things that we're really trying to do here is trying to identify these themes, these topics, these cross-regional issues, so that we can help the dynamic coalition be a presence at these discussions and contribute in a more holistic way. I want to also mention that we have an annual report that we publish, and we're still looking for people who want to contribute research and publications and case studies on these issues. That's one of the best ways to really highlight these issues at the global level. I now want to open the floor, and we'll see if we have any questions, or if other people who are here in the room would like to raise their hand and intervene, maybe perhaps continue the discussion that we're talking about. In terms of some of these different policy solutions around how do we fund journalism online in this digital marketplace. I see that Toby Mendel has his hand raised. Go ahead and speak.
Yeah, thanks. I think that, I mean, somehow taxing where the money is flowing to. So
Toby, can you please introduce yourself for those of you for those who may not know?
Yeah, sorry, Toby Mendel, the executive director of the Center for Law and Democracy, a human rights NGO based in Canada that focuses on foundational rights for democracy. I mean, I think a primary solution here has to be to sort of go where the money has flowed and get it back to what I would call the legacy media or the kind of original news generators. So that is somehow taxing the intermediaries and bringing that money back into the media. But I would like to just mention, Anya mentioned very briefly that Canada uses tax incentives. So the way that part of that works is that if you subscribe to a media service of whatever sort, you then claim that as a tax break. So it's money back into the pockets directly of consumers. I haven't studied that closely, and I don't know how much of an impact that has. Like, obviously there's a question of informing consumers that tax break exists, and then sort of that being enough to get them to go back and pay directly for legacy media content. But I do think it's an interesting idea, and it's something that's it's essentially very uncontroversial. At least it certainly was here in Canada. It's a direct flow of money back to the consumer for buying a product that we want to encourage. So I think it would be interesting to look a little bit more closely into that and see how much impact it has and whether it would be replicable in other countries.
Great, thank you, Toby. Any reactions by any of the speakers to that?
No, I mean, I'll jump in. We're very intrigued by this idea. I mean, when you're talking on an international basis, obviously you need to recognize that tax structures vary dramatically from nation to nation. This discussion, and Anya mentioned it earlier and hosted a really interesting discussion about tax credits versus tax vouchers, and really how you would administer this process whereby people can use a tax credit or get a tax credit for subscribing, or whether you create a tax voucher. It's a question of like an amount of US $250 or thereabouts that people could then elect that money goes to support local media. Bob McChesney has this what Anya called the Green New Deal idea, which would allow people to vote locally through their local post offices in the United States to determine how that money is distributed. It's very ambitious, but also I think it's interesting. It's a good idea to kind of provoke these sorts of ambitious ideas, to really think about what's possible, and then to do the organizing, the public organizing around it to make it happen. So it's a really interesting discussion. I'd like to see more on tax vouchers and tax credits. I would, again, if people are interested in more information on that, I could put it up in the chat here, point people to the CGR debate that Anya hosted a couple of weeks ago.
Great, thanks.
Very quick response if I may. I mean, I think the way it works here is when you fill out your tax return, it's a tax credit. So you fill out your tax return, which is we're doing right now in Canada, and then you put it as a claim and it comes off of your tax. So first of all, you get this sort of positive reinforcement. In that sense, I think it's very satisfying, even if the amount of money is actually quite small, which it is. It's still that sort of satisfaction that you're not paying that tax. It also is a signal to people that this is something that is sort of recognized as a public good, even if the flow is small. So it makes people feel good about engaging in it and whatever. So I think it operates at different levels to support. What I'm not sure about is whether it's widely advertised and people are sufficiently aware of it around the country to make heavy use of it. To be honest, I'm a subscriber to several news services, and I only became aware of it indirectly. My wife, in fact, told me about it, and then I had it in my tax return. So it obviously wasn't, highly advertised. So I think that's perhaps a weakness of the system.
Great, thanks, Toby. Yeah, and I think the issue would also be, how applicable is this to other scenarios? Is the situation where individuals are doing tax returns every year? Is that, we're thinking globally, what the implications of that as a good policy or a scalable policy would be? We have two really good questions, and I'm going to read both of them and then let the panelists respond. The first one is from Guy Berger from UNESCO. What do panelists think is the best way to avoid instrumentalization that could corrode journalistic integrity and editorial autonomy when public resources are channeled to the media? I think this is a question about, how do you collect public funds, and then what's that mechanism? One of the criticisms of the Australian law has been that issue that it kind of just goes to large incumbents, the Murdoch family in particular. And then we have a question from Mark Nelson, from the executive director of CIMA. He said he's glad to hear of the tax on online advertising as a way to generate revenue for journalism. But how would this operate worldwide, and how would it help developing country media producers? Another question about how do we make sure that these policies, we want them to work in places like the EU and the United States, but how do we develop them that are much more broadly applicable and implementable? Any thoughts? Is that Mira? Mira trying to, yeah. Go ahead, Mira.
Yeah, I think that both questions are excellent. And thank you, Guy, and thank you, Mark, for asking them. And both actually link to this conversation between Toby and Tim, and the question you were asking then, how do you make this operational in countries where maybe tax returns are not something that majority of population does? And especially, how do you make any tax contributions fairly, transparently distributed in countries where any public funds are used and often abused by governments to hold media, under some kind of remote, we would call it soft censorship control. So that's I think also Guy's question: what are the best ways to avoid instrumentalization? And I think that BBC Media Action is just releasing a policy piece on different subsidies and how they would work in different parts of the world as part of a project that they're doing at the moment. And so I think that they have a lot of case studies. So for instance, in Hungary, which at the moment is undergoing a lot of challenges in the media field, you can, when you do your tax return, say you have 1% or a certain percentage to give to nonprofit organizations and media companies. So you can say to which this is going to. So there is that option that is used in some of the countries. In other countries, of course, Tanya mentioned the local media subsidies. In Serbia, they are instrumentalized. And so how do you make them more transparent and more fair, especially at the local level where local reporting has all but died? So it's a really, really good question and big thinking. We're looking at, for instance, international finance institutions. So in all of these countries that have issues with transparency and accountability of allocation of public funds, a lot of international development institutions are investing money. So together with the community of freedom of expression experts, we are looking at models of using the interaction of different donors with recipient countries to make sure that if they benefit from, for instance, recovery COVID funds, that there is a mechanism to say, well, could you make sure that any pressures on journalism, also allocation of funds is done in transparent way. Of course, it's a long way to go for that. The other question on text of on online advertising, I'm sorry for taking so much time. I think it's a mechanism that would work everywhere in the world. At the moment, online advertising is actually becoming a bigger market than offline advertising. It's around $300 billion per year. And even the smallest markets have their share of online advertising. The only question is, how do you make it operational? And at what point of a transaction do you actually tax it? But as a model, that would actually be something that would be of benefit to all the countries around the world.
Yeah, I would just add quickly that this data is available on a country by country basis in terms of online advertising revenues. So if you have a model in the United States for taxing online advertising for journalism, you could take that model and model it to any country. But the one important point is to always look at advertising revenues and not profits to tax some of the larger tech platforms, because it's less easy for them to sort of hide the rabbit, so to speak, and not be obligated to pay the full amount.
Great, Tanya, I see that you want to talk about this question as well.
Yeah, just actually wanted to do a little bit of follow-up on what Mira said, and to refer specifically to the question of instrumentalization of the funds that are allocated through various state institutions or state mechanisms, which is for Serbia one of the cornerstones of corruption and instrumentalization and control over media outlets. When it comes to various forms of state financing, I would say a couple of issues are key here. One is transparency. So making all data, all the money flow, all the projects that are financing super transparent and available to public. Second one is having quite clear procedure with quite clear criteria who can participate, who can benefit these funds, what kind of conditions do you have to meet to use actually these funds. We have like paradoxical situation here in Serbia that we have tabloid media being rewarded through this state-sponsored scheme. And the third one is actually the evaluation. So we as a public or as interested stakeholders in this sector, we need to be reassured, and we need to be quite sure that money was spent in a proper manner, and that it was actually used for our own benefit, that for the benefit of our proper information and for increase of our right to be properly informed.
Great, thank you, Tanya. We have a quick follow-up from Mark, and this will probably be, we're going to run out of time. But he's responded to what has been said and said, so it depends on local governments to redistribute to media organizations. So I think this would be one question. It links to the instrumentalization question, and I also think what are the other policy ideas that are out there to do this? One, I know that there's the International Fund for Public Media that's currently in fundraising stages. So is that on the table for the kind of taxing of online revenue, or would it by default, because it's a taxation method, as Mark's question alludes to, would it then depend on local governments to determine and then distribute money? And I see Corinne has her hand raised.
Because we have a few minutes, and I'm going to try and express myself reasonably coherently given the lateness of the hour. I just want to take it slightly to one side for a second and go back to the point I mentioned in my presentation, which is, I hear what Tim is saying about the loss of advertising revenue from media outlets and the fact that it is, a lot of that has gone to big tech, but it's not that's been a very active conversation here in Australia. It's not like, you know, Facebook went and raided the banks of media outlets, and I think it's sometimes portrayed in that way. I think one of the things that really, when we think about avoiding instrumentalization, really, you know, media outlets have to accept that they are businesses, right? And there's a real discomfort in this industry with money. Money is something dirty that happens in the advertising department. It's something that you don't really get into when you're doing pure, good, wonderful journalism. It's something that happens to someone else. And I really feel you know, I've been consulting for a long time, working in newsrooms where they're adopting a digital platform or trying something new, and they've not thought about the business priorities at all. They're not engaging with the digital technologies, the data that they need. They're not thinking about products. They're not thinking in that, you know, they're not thinking about it as a product. So I really feel, you know, that at the same time as pursuing options for funding journalism, journalism has to fund itself. You know, it is a disrupted industry. My first newspaper job in the UK was in the mid-90s, and I think about maybe 2 months before, all the people called comps had lost their jobs. And I didn't know what a comp was. And the comps were the compositors. They were the people who used to cut the newspaper out and put it on the stone. And they all got killed off by InDesign and Quark, right? We are constantly in disruption, and the advertising and retail sectors are way ahead of us as an industry, have embraced digital, have found ways of monetizing. And I just feel that we also need to think about this when we want to avoid being disrupted by government or managed by government. Some of that has to be finding our own ways to making our incomes. Sorry, I feel very strongly about it.
Great. Thank you for speaking up. You know, one thing that that reminds me of, I want to just mention that SEMA, in collaboration with Luminate, are doing a study that is being conducted by Sembra Media, who many of you may know from their Inflection Point research in Latin America on digital media sustainability. This issue, you know, what are these kind of small independent newsrooms doing? Which ones are successful? Because there are some that are successful, and what are they doing, and how can that be replicated? But we're funding a second round of that research, essentially. It's going to be looking not only at Latin America, but it's going to be cross-regional: Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. So these are some of the things that we're hoping to tease out of that research. You know, what is it on the innovation side? What in this digital environment newsrooms can potentially do to help foster that? I do want to throw it, we have 3 minutes, but Tim Carr, if you have a word on that, and then also Mira.
I agree with a lot of what Corinne just said. I do, and this is a longer debate, I do have serious concerns about this idea that journalism is purely a market-driven exercise that needs to live or die based on a market-based economy. I think there is a role for renewed ideas about public funding for journalism, which does involve creating that kind of funding firewall that separates the independence of journalists and news outlets from the hot political winds of government. That's possible. There are models for that in countries around the world, and we could look at that.
Great, thanks, Tim. And Mira, do you have a one sentence, very quick intervention?
Three. I'm Serbian. I can't do one sentence, unfortunately. Yes, Corinne, you're right. I agree with Tim. We need renewed thinking around what is a public service media or public interest media funding. However, at the same time, we have a big job to do in the policy arena to make sure that digital platforms, all digital platforms, recognize the difference between the sector, such as journalism, that has professional standards and that is easily distinguishable from disinformation actors. And this is something that hasn't even started properly. And so we will be able to fund some journalism, but we will never be able to have democratic information ecosystems unless we find a way to value quality information providers online, which doesn't exist at the moment.
Great, thank you so much, Mira. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. This is clearly a conversation that's really interesting and could go on for a lot longer. I would definitely encourage people who are not signed up for the DC Sustainability to please do a search on Dynamic Coalition of Sustainability of News Media and Journalism and sign up for our mailing list. It's a very active conversation. We'd love to have you there. I would also like to thank all of the speakers, and I'd also like to thank a couple other people who made this session happen, including Andrea Cairola and Guilherme Canella from UNESCO. For giving us this slot, Jesse Guthrie, who provided the IT assistance today, and then also Jordan Higgins from GFMD, who did a lot of the legwork on the back end. So this has been really helpful, and I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of the World Press Freedom commemorations this year. Thank you.